Alright guys, so we're 1 week into the new year, which means it's time for another video, and this video is a review of the Anbernic RG35XX. If I sound a little weird, it's because I'm using an old microphone that I had before I got my new one, because my new one just stopped working for some reason, and so I ordered a new one, but it's not here yet, so you're gonna have to struggle with this for now. So I've been testing out the RG35XX for the last week and a half or so. I really hate that name. I've been trying to figure out if this is a suitable replacement for the Miyoo Mini, and I currently lean to no, but we'll get to that later. First, let's go over the specs of this thing. According to Anbernic's website, this thing uses a quad-core ARM CPU and a quad-core PowerVR GPU with just 256 megabytes of RAM. Megabytes. It has a 3.5-inch IPS display at a resolution of 640 by 480 and 64 gigabytes of internal storage. And by internal, I mean it's on this SD card that has literally all of the stuff it needs to work on it. So it's technically an SD card, but you need it to run, so I'm just considering it internal. The battery is 2100 milliamp hours, which they claim lasts 5 hours on a full charge. It costs $56 and comes in 3 colors: transparent white, transparent purple, and gray. Alright, so hardware-wise, this thing is pretty mediocre. Anbernic has been known for their solid D-pads for a long while now, but I don't think this device has that benefit. The D-pad feels mushy, and while it is serviceable, I've noticed that while trying to press one side, like go in one direction, it's hit diagonal inputs. You could try to justify it by saying that it's a small device, or that they wanted to prioritize comfortability over the solid D-pad or something, which, one, why would they do that? And two, they have small devices with good D-pads, so it's not like this is like an exception or anything. They could have just put an old D-pad they used into this one. So you can't really excuse this. There's been other D-pads on small devices from Anbernic before with good D-pads. I know I said that the D-pad on the RG505 was good, which is essentially the same D-pad on this thing, but I think that's just because I had more space to put my thumbs in like the back of my hands and stuff, so I could move my thumb to make sure that I wasn't going to hit any diagonal inputs by accident like I would on this. And honestly, I'm not even sure if it is by accident, because this thing hits diagonals when I'm not even hitting diagonals. I could just probably replace the D-pad with something better like you can with the Miyoo Mini, but I shouldn't have to. And Anbernic, like I said, is known for their good D-pads, so I feel like you should have just put a good D-pad in here instead of putting a mediocre one in and hoping nobody cares. This is a cheap device, and I understand that, so I shouldn't expect the world from this thing, but just put a good D-pad in, like, come on. Aside from the D-pad though, everything else on here feels pretty good, at least in terms of hardware. The ABXY buttons aren't super clicky, but they do require a bit of force to like push them down at all, and they feel like actual buttons, so I guess that's good. I only went with the transparent purple because like that's everybody's favorite color for some reason. Everybody keeps gawking over these transparent purple colors, like on the Odin, the Anbernic devices, and Ion Neo devices. Like Atomic Purple has for some reason become really popular in the retro gaming community, probably because of the N64 controller. I do have one, I just don't want to get it down. So at this point the video went out of focus. There's not much I can do about it. I just want to say I'm sorry about it. I'm not entirely sure how it happened, but I just want to let you know. I feel better buttons, but this isn't like the Powkiddy X18S where I have to complain that the start and select buttons feel better than the ABXY buttons, because they don't. The start and select buttons feel nice. This might just be because they're set up like an SNES controller, but they feel kind of mushy in comparison. It's like a mind trick I can't explain. And they also seem to travel a bit more. I can't really prove that. It might just be another consequence of the design, but that's just what I observed. I think what it actually is that the ABXY buttons kind of feel like they're pressing into something, and they have like a stopgap between them and like the back of this device. Whereas the start and select buttons have the same thing, except it's much farther into the device. Like pressing it, they travel, they like kind of they can go really close to being flush with the device. Whereas the ABXY buttons will still have a little bit of the buttons sticking out, even if you press them in all the way. I don't even hate the design. It's made it super easy to just plop it in my bag and forget about it and play it whenever I have some downtime. And in that downtime, it's much easier to play something like a level of Yoshi's Island than it is to play something like Luigi's Mansion. It may be uncomfortable for some, but I haven't had my hands cramp up at all while using this. And it's been great for emulation of like more retro systems, like the 2D retro system, since the GameCube is retro now. It's able to play a bunch of things that are older and don't require much power to run, like the GBA or the SNES. And that's not that much power, but honestly, in a device like this, I'm not sure I'd want a lot of power, because with only a D-pad and face buttons, I don't want to play anything 3D. I've seen some people complain about the triggers and how loud they are, but I actually like them. Sure, it isn't ideal, but they're clicky, and in my opinion, good. They are quite loud, but they serve their purpose and do it well. The shoulder buttons can be used as hotkeys in RetroArch, so do with that what you will. I thought I just mentioned it if you want like to know that. The speaker isn't horrible. Out of all the things I'm worried about on a small device like this, the speaker is probably at the bottom of the list, just because on a device like this, I want the controls to be good and I want the form factor to be good for such a small device. The speaker is really something I'm not concerned about. But for a single speaker, it sounds good. You don't get a lot of bass, but like I said, that's probably not my biggest concern. You don't get a lot of bass, but like I said, it's very much serviceable, and I'm happy with it. Turning up the volume to the highest level, you can hear some distortion, but it doesn't sound bad. It's way better than whatever was in the original Game Boy, I can tell you that. Turning it down even a little bit will make the volume and distortion less noticeable, and it still sounds great. Side tangent, I hate to be that kind of reviewer, but seems like everything's not so sturdy in there. It's not a big negative, and you're not even gonna notice it if you're not looking for it, but I thought I'd just point it out. And all of you that hate that kind of like rattle test or whatever other people call it, please don't unsubscribe. Speaking of low quality stuff, the pre-installed firmware is trash. It had bad translations and just looked bad overall. And up until about 2 weeks ago, or like a week ago, depending on when you're watching this or when this video goes out, that's the only option you had. But like a week and a half ago, Black Seraph put on his Patreon a version of Garlic OS for the RG35XX. I hate that name. We now have a RetroArch based firmware running on here, thanks to Black Seraph, which is great. If I didn't burp in the middle of that sentence. It's being updated pretty frequently, so what's shown in this video is probably not indicative of what it looks like now, depending on when you're watching this. But even in its barest state, back when it was just RetroArch, it was still better than whatever Anbernic gave us. Leaps and bounds better, if you could say. It has a nice menu that gives you the options to go to your recent games, your favorite games, your consoles, and just plain RetroArch. The menu is really useful. It's really easy to just get in, choose a game, and start playing, which I guess you could say the same about Anbernic's firmware, but it just looked bad and I hated using it. So I'm not gonna. Like I said, you could argue that it isn't much different from the stock firmware, but one, yes it is, and two, even if it was just kind of like an aesthetic change, I would still choose this one over the stock one, just because I hated how the first one looked. Game Rooms was really funny. This one is much more visually appealing, so I much rather use this one than the old one. I mentioned in my impressions video that the power button could be used as kind of like a backlight, like a brightness changer, but it seems that that's either been changed or like removed entirely, which was kind of annoying, because if I was playing in the dark or in my bed, it would be nice to kind of have like a brightness changer like on the fly, which was useful through the power button, because right now the power button does nothing unless you hold it down and power off the system entirely. It's not the end of the world. It's barely even a complaint, but I did like that with the original Black Seraph firmware. Something that was really bothering me about this device up until a few days ago was the screen tearing. If you saw my tweet, you know what I'm talking about, but essentially the emulators would have this weird kind of like graphical glitch at the borders, and there would be so much screen tearing like throughout the gameplay, and it just made the whole gameplay experience worse. And I couldn't tell if this was an Anbernic issue or a Black Seraph issue. But as I was writing this script, Black Seraph updated the firmware that he put onto his Patreon page and noted that quote, "VSync should now work better, less tearing once again," end quote. So I guess that gives me my answer. And I can say that he is correct, because right after I installed this new updated firmware, I jumped right into Yoshi's Island, which I'd been playing on this device and the RG505 like a bunch, and noticed like no screen tearing at all, like no noticeable screen tearing. There is some noticeable screen tearing if you plug it into an external display or like try to capture footage from it, but playing on the device itself, it's not noticeable. There was horrible screen tearing before this update. Now that that's out, screen tearing is fixed perpetually, like at least for the most part it's fixed, which I'm glad about, because I was looking at that, I was like, could they really make a device with this bad screen tearing? But I guess they didn't, my bad. Can't blame Anbernic for everything, I guess. Emulation is good. Screen tearing was my biggest issue, but now that that's fixed, I don't really have much to complain about in terms of emulation. Nothing phenomenal is coming out of this thing, but I'm not sure you'd really want anything phenomenal to come out of this thing. Like, it's a $56 device with a D-pad and ABXY buttons. Would you really want to play something like N64 games on here? Like I said, it's much easier to play something like Yoshi's Island when I have downtime than Luigi's Mansion. Now, the title does say not perfect, so what other gripes could I really have with this device? Let me tell you. It's just the seeming lack of effort they put in this device. Like, it's not a horrible device, but it has enough noticeable flaws that it hinder the gaming experience, and they just make me go, why? The abysmal stock firmware is annoying to use, and having to install a custom firmware at all was pretty annoying. I understand that devices at this price point usually don't have much in terms of like good firmware, but that's not an excuse, and it also doesn't mean all devices under the price point have to have bad firmware. The install process was pretty easy for Black Seraph's firmware, but at the same time, I still hate that I even had to do it in the first place. Like, Anbernic has their own game launcher, their own stock firmware type thing on the RG505, which I'm not sure would have run on here because this is a Linux-based handheld and that's a Android-based handheld, but still, you couldn't figure something out instead of giving like the bare minimum. I don't know why that became such a tangent, but you know what else annoys me? The build quality. Don't worry, I'm not doing another shake test. I've already talked about this at length earlier in the video, but just to expand on it a little more, I feel like the D-pad isn't as good as it should be. Like, on a device like this, when your only form of movement is the D-pad and the ABXY buttons, I feel like the D-pad should be the main priority, at least in terms of control. Like, why do your triggers feel good, the ABXY buttons feel pretty good, and the D-pad feels mushy when that's what you're gonna use to play? This is just my opinion, but I feel like on a device that's already cramped, the D-pad should be the first priority. Also, the device is just, how do I describe this? Weird. It's not a bad design, and I do like a lot about it, but there's just something off about it. Maybe it's just a bias or something. I don't know, but I feel like something's just not right. All right, spend a few lines complaining about something very vague. I've become a true reviewer. Moving on from that, let's conclude this. So I have mixed feelings about this thing. The biggest issue I had with this thing up until a few days ago, like I said, was the screen tearing. But that being fixed doesn't necessarily make it an amazing device. Sure, it suits its purpose, but a device like this shouldn't just be serviceable, it should be great, especially in a device market that's become so oversaturated that so many devices are coming out looking just like ones made by other companies. I want to see something at least a little new. I want to see Anbernic put a new spin on the Miu Mini type device, but it seems they kind of just took the Miu Mini formula, kind of expanded it a bit, and released that. The device didn't live up to its full potential. All of the little quirks that could have been written off on their own, or even a few in a pair could have been written off, all add up to make this a poor gaming experience. Like, it's not a bad gaming experience, but it's just not ideal. Sure, it's serviceable, but when Powkiddy was able to put a better Linux front end on their device than you are 2 years later, I think that shows a little bit of a problem. Or at least that you need to try a little harder when you make a refresh of this thing, which they inevitably will. And honestly, I don't know what I'd want from that. This will probably axe me from ever working with Anbernic in the future, but if that's what honesty gets you, I don't care. I do want to add before I close this out that I don't really hate this thing. I do have a lot of gripes with it, but I do like it for on-the-go gaming, like quick pick-up-and-play type gaming, experiences and stuff like that. Aside from the Miu Mini, it's probably the best small pick up and play type emulator, and with the Miu Mini being perpetually out of stock and rarely getting refreshed or getting put back into stock, this might be your best bet. If you're looking for a quick and easy way to play older retro systems, this is probably the go-to for you. If you have a little bit more money to spend, I'd say look around at other devices, but if you don't, this is probably the best bet. But you have to take into account all of the things I've listed and other people have listed in their reviews, talking about the negatives and positives. I do kind of love this thing, but at the same time, I think I like the concept of it more than I do the actual device. But what do you guys think? Have you ordered one of these? Do you already have one of these? Do you share any of the opinions I do? Do you disagree? Do you have a Miu Mini and we're thinking about getting this as a kind of alternative? Let me know in the comments, and I will see you next week. Bye-bye.